Hello all, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at why America was never founded as a Christian nation. Though modern political movements would have you believe otherwise, and America does have many quite rich and valuable traditions rooted in Christianity, many of our founding fathers were fully cognizant of just how disastrous basing America on Christianity would be, setting the nation up for certain failure. And to see why that is, it helps to explore America's religious circumstances prior to the Revolution. After the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s and King Henry VIII's following schism from Catholicism, people were reading the Bible for themselves for the first time ever and reaching conflicting interpretations of its messages, leading to Christianity diversifying in a way that had never been possible prior, but also leading to unspeakably sadistic violence between supporters of those conflicting interpretations, mistakenly believing that God would choose a victor and identify his chosen brand of Christianity. Christianity itself came to civil war, and its believers slaughtered each other by the tens of thousands, with estimates as high as 10 million total victims, inspiring many to flee Europe and seek refuge in the New World. Christian groups like the Anglicans, Quakers, and Puritans formed communities across New England's colonies, several becoming enormously prosperous, like Pennsylvania's Quakers, who, though they didn't make it an official state religion, effectively formed a theocracy after gaining total control over the colony's political, social, and economic worlds. However, it turned out that religious violence was by no means quarantined to Europe, many Christian immigrants having carried it along with them. And unsurprisingly, that violence threatening the colony's general stability and cohesion. Though smaller offshoots of Christianity commonly championed religious freedom, more successful denominations usually took strides to weave their belief systems into their governments, many instituting mandatory church attendance, and some not just inflicting state-mandated persecution of those rival Christian faiths, but sometimes even capital punishment. By the 1700s, new denominations and sub-denominations were sprouting across the colonies, and though some Christians were ardently against it, others were caught up in the emotionally supercharged religious frenzy of the First Great Awakening movement that largely formed in response to the enormous popularity of the more emotionally subdued reason, science, and logic that defined the West's growing Enlightenment movement. With the West's Christian denominations already often sharply conflicting, the Great Awakening's compelling and supercharged emotions amplified their polarity and perforated the social fabric of the proto-US with piercing religious ideological divisions, fostering an influx of religious extremism, which is where America's founding fathers come into the picture. Though there was effectively unanimous agreement among the founding fathers that religion had no business in federal government, others were more amenable to its presence in state government, unsurprisingly including figures like John Adams, who would go on to persecute the Quakers as president. Similarly, his cousin Sam Adams championed the creation of a, quote, Christian Sparta, populated with highly educated citizens who upheld the virtues of Christianity, performed the public duties necessary to maintaining a democracy, and denied themselves the excesses of luxury in general. You also have America's first president, George Washington, who didn't strictly oppose the idea of blending religion with state government, but given that he stopped taking communion, didn't greatly emphasize Christianity in his writings, and advocated religious freedom in his Newport letter written to a synagogue in Rhode Island, it seems safe to say that he wasn't as open to it as the Addams family were. On the other side of the coin, several founding fathers were strictly opposed to uniting government and religion in any way, fighting far more fiercely to ensure their separation because they had a greater grasp of history and human nature, recognizing the interminable battle for power between religion and government that had wreaked havoc on populations for millennia, and that their republic would certainly dissolve were it allowed to happen. For instance, there's founding father John Dickinson, who was raised Quaker but saw moral flaws in all faiths and clashed deeply with John Adams over just how powerful the government should be, and refused to sign the Declaration of Independence because he feared that the colonies were too divided to stage a successful rebellion against England, and felt that the Declaration left space for religious persecution. Next, you have founding father Thomas Paine, who wrote the immensely popular booklet Common Sense, often called the catalyst that sparked the American Revolution. Though Paine had such an outsized influence on America's founding, and his other works did communicate reverence for the teachings of Jesus, he also highlighted how Jesus' legacy had been manipulated for personal gain, contradictions within the Bible's text, and how the top-down social structure of most churches cultivated endless corruption, unfortunately leading many Americans to dismiss Paine as an atheist. Moving on to presidents, you've got Thomas Jefferson, who, in his 1802 Danbury letter to a Baptist congregation, quite explicitly argued against government's meddling in religion, but also wrote and fought ferociously for the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, an effort he felt was more important than his presidency and served as the basis for the First Amendment to the Constitution. Finally, you've got father of the Constitution, President Madison, who helped pass Jefferson's Statute for Religious Freedom, argued for limiting the total acreage that any denomination could own, and argued against having chaplains in Congress or the Army. Having witnessed the Great Awakening's extensive persecution and fanaticism in his youth, and as a lifelong student of history and human nature, perhaps more than any other president, Madison recognized the destructive patterns of behavior so commonly connected with the union of religion and government. He denounced its tendencies toward corrupting both the clergy and their parishioners, insisting it bred, quote, servility, superstition, and bigotry. Madison claimed that personal views on religion were of no more impact on civic life than, quote, physics or geometry, and argued that the separation of church and state was a fundamental necessity for the U.S. to achieve its true, unmatched, and explosive potential. Despite voicing deep reverence for America's founding fathers and U.S. history, a growing segment of the American social world has been seeking to unite faith and government in recent decades, claiming that America was founded as a Christian nation and that it should now be one by law. But even aside from everything mentioned thus far, there are some curious and glaring problems with that perspective. Were America founded as a Christian nation, it seems a little odd that none of our founders directed the federal government to recognize any Christian holidays. It seems a little odd that President Washington founded Washington, D.C. using Freemason rituals rather than Christian ones. It seems a little odd that Jefferson compiled his own version of the New Testament that redacted all instances of the supernatural, and some claim he owned a copy of the infamous book, The Three Impostors. It seems a little odd that America's first founding document, the Declaration of Independence, mentions the laws of nature before the laws of God. So, if America wasn't founded on Christianity, what was it founded on? As mentioned in previous videos, the radical concept that made America's founding so monumental and unprecedented, the concept that delegitimized countless preceding monarchies, oligarchies, and theocracies, was declaring that might doesn't make right, that the only morals worth having are the kind that are universal and objective, applying to all people across all time. That concept came from the hybrid of philosophy and science, comprising the previously mentioned Enlightenment movement, it being no coincidence that our democracy became known as the American experiment. Basing a nation on that concept is what makes America's founding fathers timeless and so much greater than their many profound personal faults. But just because unparalleled strength no longer gave its bearer exclusive rights to dictate moral legitimacy, that doesn't mean that it didn't still often win out. Long before the US was a global superpower, the American experiment's universal objective values convinced believers worldwide that US democracy would conquer the entire globe. But instead of conquest through bullets and subjugation, as England and other empires had, people and nations would consent to American democracy and willingly gravitate to it out of recognition that doing so was in their own best self-interest. Much as early Christianity had such colossal appeal because it promoted universal and objective values, America's founding had the same potential, and that was the original source of its divine providence. Following the nation's founding, Americans exercised their religious freedom fervently, and the early 1800s saw a second Great Awakening. New denominations, communes, and Christian cults sprouted across the states, but particularly in New York's burned-over district, where brimstone and righteous holy fire had scorched the land and inflamed the hearts of American believers, resurrecting many characteristics of the First Great Awakening, particularly its emotionally supercharged holy zeal. Itinerant preachers came to national fame and toured the states, unleashing fiery verbal broadsides on yearning congregations. The nation saw its first megachurches in the form of colossal traveling tents that housed thousands in weeks-long revivals and blended faith with spectacle and entertainment. Many were convinced that they were living in the end times and acted accordingly, ridding themselves of their earthly possessions and occupations. Religious extremists and conspiracies multiplied rapidly, many warning for decades that Catholicism was seeking to overthrow the US government, and much of the nation starkly opposed to electing Catholic representatives, certain that they would inevitably put Rome's interests over America's, and cognizant of Catholicism's countless examples of unfathomable corruption, power lust, and responsibility for myriad horrors across history. And though the more stoic, rational Enlightenment movement was beginning to wane, American Christians kept many of its principles alive by performing the social functions necessary to nurturing a democracy, seeking to serve and not be served, with many Christian thinkers teaching that persistent mental and physical development were a moral obligation in order to serve others more effectively, demonstrating the potency of their belief system through their actions. Christians condemned the self-interested vices of luxury and excess, while fostering democracy-building means like the Protestant work ethic and social movements like muscular Christianity. Were those still the values of Christianity, there would be no point in making this video because they synchronize so closely with the values America was founded on. But unfortunately, they were commandeered and perverted by many seeking to empower themselves instead of the country, and America is now seeing far more insidious attempts at brute forcing the US into a new modern Great Awakening. Where previous Great Awakenings had grassroots and sprouted organically, over the past several decades, many ostensible Christians have labored feverishly to astroturf a new Great Awakening through sheer obstinacy and determination. Like so many before them, they've made the same hyper-emotional appeals to division, extremism, and conspiracy, but it's an inherently futile effort that's doomed to fail because it's built on faulty, irreparable foundations that have nothing to do with the original values of Christianity. They've demanded the return of Christian values, but you could put the 10 Commandments every 10 feet and tattoo it on every forehead, but that wouldn't change anything because that's not how people learn to adopt moral behaviors. The real problem is that those who make the loudest and strongest calls for the return of Christian values are all too often the same people who wear their professed morals as a fig leaf, desperate to disguise their naked corruption. When it comes to real-world examples, though the left is certainly guilty of it too, that's why there are more subscribers to porn services in red states. That's why the strongest supporters of conservative Christian family values so often have sordid histories of infidelity and divorce. That's why the supposed party of principles justifies their anti-democratic behaviors by claiming to believe the other party did it first. The real problem is that those calling for the resurrection of Christian values very conveniently ignore that it was almost universally Christian men who led America into its current quagmire, vicious cycle, doom spiral. That is to say that the culture and nation that Christian men created made genuine Christianity obsolete. The new Great Awakening's values are, unsurprisingly, endlessly profitable. And though most Americans still call themselves Christian, they devote far more time, effort, and effectively their entire lives to elevating a supremely anti-Christian economy. An economy that requires unemployed citizens by design, benefits enormously from gambling, and is built to ensure the existence of industries like the drug trade and sex work. An economy that's aggressively annihilating the environment and creatures they claim to believe God created. Where the God of America's founders was encapsulated with words like truth and love, the new American God cherishes nothing more than wealth and attention. The 10 Commandments have been euthanized by the 10 pillars of economic wisdom. The overwhelming majority of men who created that economy over the past 2 centuries called themselves Christian. And perhaps the real issue at the heart of all of this is that only someone who believes in an afterlife, only someone who values this life so little and fails to comprehend what an unfathomably profound and spectacular gift it is, could justify sacrificing billions of lives to appeasing and satiating an inherently insatiable economy. With the rule of law serving as the backbone of democracy, starting with figures like Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell in the 1970s, many have successfully taken strides to implement the new Great Awakening's profitable values, simultaneously cultivating tremendous corruption. On the smaller scale and local level, though we trust our nation's police officers with the duty of performing the vital physical hands-on maintenance that gives our laws and consequently our democracy legitimacy and value, once again, it's mostly Christian men who have given our police forces nationwide, urban and rural, reputations for unspeakable corruption. On a much larger scale and national level, in recent decades, we've also seen the new Great Awakening's values and corruption lay siege to the Supreme Court. Though across time, we've seen Christian thinkers like St. Augustine, Martin Luther, and John Locke insist that the separation of church and state is fundamental to preventing government corruption and bolstering government stability. Our Supreme Court justices have been doggedly dismantling that barrier and simultaneously their own legitimacy by placing personal values over those that the nation was founded on, elevating supposed Christian rights and relegating human rights. With the Supreme Court ideally occupied by American citizens, fortified with the greatest comprehension of the intricacies of law and ethics that our nation has to offer, justices like Alito and Thomas have contended that there are no morals outside of religion, that secular citizens are innately incapable of guidance from a legitimate moral compass, demonstrating their fundamental misunderstanding of human biology, history, and morality in general. With the help of men like Federalist Society chairman Leonard Leo, America has subdued its one-time fear of Catholicism, that faith now having a majority presence on the Supreme Court and not being remotely reflective of the wider population. Flouting the Constitution they so often profess to uphold and revere, the new Great Awakening Supreme Court has led an assault on the First and 10th Amendments while eviscerating the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, aka the pillars of America's second founding erected after the Civil War. Though there have certainly been an abundance of corrupt justices across Supreme Court history, for the first time we're seeing calls for a Supreme Court code of ethics. And not coincidentally, it's the justices who claim the strongest roots in religious morals who are drowning in ethical violations. That internal void of universal and objective morals has infected their rulings too, and we've seen the new Great Awakening Supreme Court legalize gambling, legalize kickbacks and quid pro quo for Congress, and legalize democracy-destroying financial fraud in our elections. The new Great Awakening subscribers often refer to themselves as Christian nationalists, mistakenly insisting that the nation was founded on Christianity, and accurately claiming that most Americans are Christian, so it should be a Christian nation, but seemingly can't be bothered to study the nation's history enough to see the very basic errors in their perspective. With many of America's founders having been students of history and human nature, and in support of the objective values that the nation was founded on, America's founding fathers were quite cognizant of and took measures to prevent what's known as tyranny of the majority, when populations attempt to codify the majority's values in ways that violate the basic human rights of people who aren't in that majority, with preventing tyranny of the majority being a basic duty of the Supreme Court. Tyranny of the majority is fundamental to the social structures of monarchies and autocracies like Russia, China, or India, an extreme contradiction of the freedom that defines America and what makes us so unique. The same people who want government out of their lives want to use the government to penetrate the lives of others, and that's just one minor example of the countless contradictions and inconsistencies at the core of the new Great Awakening's Christian nationalism. When it comes to the nationalism side of the issue, as highlighted by Bush the First's, quote, suicidal nationalism in his famous Chicken Kiev speech, and as explained by French President Charles de Gaulle, where patriotism is about loving a country and its people, nationalism is about hating other countries and peoples. As demonstrated most thoroughly by the Nazis, movements founded on hate and contradiction can be quite successful in the short term, but in the long run, they're always doomed to fail. When it comes to the Christian side of the issue, the question always comes down to which brand of Christianity are you going to enforce? The Supreme Court's Catholicism? The Orthodox Church that many Christian nationalists are working to revivify, that fosters a rivalry with many of America's more traditional denominations? Even within the same congregation, there are starkly contrasting perspectives and interpretations of the Bible's messages, and it seems a little suspicious that God has the exact same values as his many followers, but they can't seem to agree on what those are. Particularly since the Protestant Reformation, but even going back to the very founding of Christianity, those conflicting perspectives and interpretations have had horrific, monstrous consequences, inciting centuries of warfare, massacre, and claiming many millions of lives. How many of those slaughtered might have gone on to make the world a better place? When it comes to Christian nationalism's major contradictions, the glaring issue is that its values are so far estranged and divorced from the universal values taught by Jesus, the values shared by all world religions and the basis for America's founding. That's why it's so vital that Americans, as championed by President John Quincy Adams, Adams, quote, cleave to the principles of America's founding documents, specifically the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, demonstrating just how far removed the New Great Awakening's values are from Christianity's original form, and confirmed in the deaths of Jesus's first followers like James the Just, Stephen, and many of his disciples. Authors like Terry Eagleton have taken that to its logical conclusion and said, if you follow Jesus and don't end up dead, it appears you have some explaining to do. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche took that a step further and said that there had only ever been one Christian and he died on the cross. Given Jesus's teachings in his famous Sermon on the Mount, or his many explicit rebukes of the worldly power sought by men like the Pharisees, his disciple Peter, and the Jewish politicians of his time, it might well be said that any politician who claims Christianity is a total farce, given that Jesus's first followers held all of their belongings in common, were mendicants, and referred to themselves as the poor. It might even be said that calling for America to be a Christian nation is a supremely socialist position, where philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and many others have called religion a natural human response to enduring stressful circumstances. As seen now and repeatedly across history, religion does tend to flourish when populations are under intense pressures, and as more American citizens are squeezed from every direction for every last dime, thanks to a government that's fully synthesized with business, more Americans are calling for a Christian nation. Populations consistently respond to stress with quite predictable behaviors, and practicing religion is just one of them. But religious freedom is among our nation's most fundamental values, and that isn't possible without a government that maintains a strictly neutral stance on religion. The survival of any nation hinges on the social bonds established by the shared knowledge and values of its people, with scientist, philosopher, and founding father Benjamin Franklin insisting that our republic will only survive if it has, quote, virtuous citizens. America's founding did indeed draw inspiration from the values of Christianity, but also just as much, if not more, from the values fostered by the science/philosophy of ancient Greece. And as ancient Greece's philosopher Socrates explained, genuine virtue manifests in the form of self-improvement, largely in the form of self-education. As Socrates also explained, genuine piety manifests through improving the lives of others, friend and foe alike, again largely through education and practices that defined much of American Christianity in the 1800s, strengthening our nation to such an extent that many were certain it would trigger a global cascade of American democracy. As explained by founding father James Madison, a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Self-improvement is democracy, and as opposed to the money and attention that empowers monarchies, oligarchies, and fascism, that's why education is called the currency of democracy. President Garfield explained the issue with, "Our system of government is based on the intelligence of the people. Any unrepresented and hopelessly disenfranchised class will inevitably be struck with intellectual paralysis. We must pour upon them all the light of our public schools. We must make them intelligent, industrious, patriotic citizens, or they will drag us and our children down. Shall we make the fatal mistake of building up freedom and make no provision to increase the intelligence of the citizen?" Self-education is democracy because it makes it possible to more fully understand the extensive consequences of your actions. Self-education is democracy because it makes it possible to more fully understand the actions of others, to see that Democrats and Republicans aren't inherently evil, just misguided. and that makes it more difficult to judge them. Self-education is democracy because it reveals precisely why the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal. Without education, the Declaration of Independence's pursuit of happiness is purely a product of biological impulse, a major source of the most obscene and inhuman behaviors across history. Self-education makes it easier to detect and effectively respond to frauds, pathological liars, and other enemies of democracy. And as a self-governing member of a democracy, it's a fundamental duty of every citizen to be able to identify those traitors. Though the nation's current social, economic, and political circumstances can make it appear as though the problems are impossible to fix, Americans do the impossible because it's what our nation was founded on, doing what no other nation had ever even attempted by declaring that might doesn't make right. Self-education is the first step to practicing democracy and resurrecting America's founding values, particularly by studying history and human nature, but I'll try to pick out some of the highlights in coming videos.